Marino Show. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Marino Show. I'm your host, David Marino. Today, I'm joined by filmmaker Alex Mackellar. He also has a podcast, Mack's Paranormal Podcast, and a YouTube channel, Mack's Paranormal. But he's in the process of making his first feature-length film. He made his first short film, Halloween Hour, and it was great. I watched it. Alex, thank you so much for being with me today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So tell me about how you got into filmmaking. As I mentioned, your first short film, Halloween Hour, is out. I encourage people to go watch it. I'll put a link in the post for this, but it's a great short film. How did you get involved in the filmmaking process?
Thanks. I mean, in Austin, there's a lot of talent and creativity, and I always wanted to make films. And so the first thing I did was I started writing stories, and then I started the podcast because it's a lot cheaper and at least less resources to get a microphone, write the stories out, voice act, add everything together. And then I was like, well, now that I've kind of got that under my belt, that's kind of like practice script writing. I was like, well, let's start, making short films. And my mom actually, she's the one that kind of encouraged me to start making films because my mom and my sister, they're both hair and makeup artists, and they've been in like the business for like 5 years now. And so they have a lot of connections. And so with those connections, we came together and made Halloween Hour. And the plan was just to make like a short film every year for the YouTube channel. But then my mom was like, why don't you just make a movie if you have the resources? And so I sat on it and I was like, yeah, why not? So after we did Halloween Hour, it was good just to kind of get her, you know, kind of easily get into filmmaking. And so now we're making The Court. I just finished the script for that. And I actually have a meeting with the director of photography later today. And we're going to go over just everything that we're going to need for production just to make the filming a lot easier.
Tell everybody about Halloween Hour. Like, what's it about for those who haven't seen it?
So Halloween Hour is one of those things. It took us 14 hours to film, and it was just one night, and I just had an idea. It was one of those stories where I just said, hey, with filmmaking, when you get into it, you kind of have to make do with what you have. So with that being said, we only had one location, which was my apartment. And so I was like, well, how can we make a story in just like my apartment? And so then I thought about it. I was like, oh, well, I love lore. Like folklore is probably one of my favorite genres of horror because there's just so much you can learn from it. And if you look at folklore, there's a lot of truth. It might not be like what you're expecting, but there's like a nugget of truth behind every folklore. And so I was like, well, I want to make my own. And I was thinking about Halloween, and I was like, oh, well, no one really has any folklore around Halloween. So I try to incorporate that into the short film.
Have fun in the best way you can. And you know the rule, just don't open the door the last hour of midnight. You should be fine.
No, what? What are we talking about?
The last hour of Halloween, you're not supposed to open the door.
Why?
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Ay, ay, ay. How did you ever live without me?
I have no idea.
Okay. The last hour of Halloween, 11 p.m. to midnight, is when demons and evil spirits are at their strongest. I'm serious. They're at their strongest, and they will try to get into your house. And if you open the door, I'm not kidding, they'll knock on your door, they'll knock on your window, and if you open the door and you let them in, you are giving them legal grounds to enter and wreak havoc on your life.
You're just screwing with me. Come on.
I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm really not screwing with you. No, I'm dead serious. I'm serious. My nanny told me this when I was a kid.
Your nanny?
Yes, she was from Bolivia.
I thought it was really good. It was very well done. And like you said, it's in one location. And that's what I love about indie filmmaking is that, I mean, I know that there are challenges behind it because you have fewer resources, but I always feel like what comes out of it, a lot of the filmmakers I talk to, they turn out a really great film in the end by having to improvise and kind of just figure it out. Did you find that to be the experience making this first short film?
Oh, yes. I love it because when you have limited tools and if you can make gold out of those little tools, then you're just like, wow. I mean, then when you actually get like the bigger budget, you're like, oh, we can easily accomplish this. So I feel like if you want to get into filmmaking, definitely just, just start doing it. There's really nothing better than just like getting a camera, learning the audio. And the more you learn about it as a director, the better director you'll become. The more of like, okay, well, I know we can, this is viable, but this isn't. And so then it kind of makes the script writing and everything else so much easier. So yes, it's definitely good to kind of just, if you're limited and if you can make good products or good films. And what I've learned is that like it made me focus on dialogue and the story more. And from my experience, if you have a good story and good dialogue, you can pretty much sell any film. Everything else, because the audience will appreciate uh, the realness, I guess, that comes with good dialogue and a good story.
Have you always been interested in film, like from a young age, or was this something that you just sort of started to fall into, or have you always had aspirations to be a filmmaker?
I always had aspirations, but the toughest thing about being a filmmaker is having the right people. And so I've made a lot of friends, a lot of great, talented people, and we're just like, yeah, let's just start making movies. Austin is, Austin's one of those where if you want to make it, you're going to have to kind of throw yourself into making movies. There's talent here, but I feel like a lot of people don't know where to put that talent. Um, and I think everything kind of led to right now. I've always wanted to make films. I always thought I love horror. Horror is my favorite genre. And what I love about horror is that horror is used as like metaphors for like real trauma. And I feel like a lot of people, when you're put into like a really bad situation, horror shows you like, well, these are like the ways you can get out of that situation. And one of my favorite like storytelling elements is like if you take the monster away, then what's the real horror that people are left with? And that's kind of like where my stories come from. There's always like a sense of, I guess, realism to the stories that I'm trying to tell.
I love horror for that very reason. I mean, I grew up watching all of the slasher flicks in the 80s, the Friday the 13th, those types of films, which some people write off, but I've always loved them. But I think you're right. I think there's a huge, in the horror community, it's a very tight knit community and people really bond over these films. And I think a lot of it is because they've experienced some trauma in their lives or they relate to it on a certain level, and people don't always get that. So I love that you said that, because I think while some people write horror movies off as they're just, they're not as important as these other movies that are supposed to have more of an impact on society, I think that they're really important in the overall landscape. Wouldn't you say that's true as well?
Oh, for sure. And that's why I think people gravitate towards horror. There's like, yeah, people like being scared, but I always enjoy the story behind horror. So, for instance, one of my stories, Valentine Sucks. It was,
I saw that on your YouTube channel. Yeah.
yeah, so that's the stories. Like a lot of my podcasts, I just put them on YouTube just so more ears can hear it. But the real life trauma behind that, I used a Filipino monster to hide what the real horror was, and it had to deal with, I guess, a tough situation for some people, but losing a child through pregnancy and how some people don't ever come back from that, and how it's like very so it's very like real, and that's how I kind of like presented that. So if you take that monster away, again, what you're left with is like the real trauma that people go with through every day.
She began to change. Her porcelain skin modified into a gray, rough texture. I could hear bones cracking and organs twisting. Huge bat-like wings sprouted from her back. Her luscious hair transformed into thick, coarse black fur. Her face was no longer beautiful. She looked like a damn bat or demon. Her hands were the last part of her to change. They grew twice in size, and her fingernails were like black, jagged knives. She used those serrated fingernails on herself. She cut a perfect line across her
I feel like that's
stomach.
what good filmmakers do, is that like, especially horror filmmakers, like for me, with a scary movie, like, yeah, there's a jump scare and it might get you the first time, but then you watch it a few more times and you're kind of like, okay, I know it's coming. And then what are you left with? You're left with the story. And so if the story sucks, you're just like, man, why am I even watching this? So that's why I was like, yeah, when I make horror movies, I don't want it to just be like, oh, that was a good horror movie. I just want people like, that was just a good story. That was just a good film in general. So I like movies like Hereditary, stuff like that, because one, they're beautiful, but also like there really wasn't many jump scares, and that's what I feel like a lot of horror fans, they're not there for the jump scares, they're there for like the stories and like the aesthetic of horror movies.
And I was going to just ask you what are some of your favorite horror? So Hereditary is one of them. What are some others that you love?
Oh man, I think one of my I mean, there's so many, but one that really resonated with me growing up as a kid was An American Werewolf in London. And the reason why is John Landis, he did a really good job at making these charismatic characters and how they respond to like just the shitty situation that they're in. And I just thought, wow, that just like the humor isn't like, someone slips on a banana or something like that. It's more like, again, the charismatic way the lead character went about the situation, and that kind of stuck with me. So that's how I kind of want to tell stories. Um, Kind of like Quentin Tarantino. A lot of his movies are very, violent, but also very humorous, with just like the way he writes characters. So that's kind of like what I want to do, is have like that subtlety of humor, but not like over the top where it's like in your face. But again, to answer your question, American Horror Story. But I loved Evil Dead with Sam Raimi because I love what he did with that film. It was more just him and a group of friends went into the woods, like barely any script, and just made this like incredible movie. And I love the practicals. The Thing is one of my favorite movies. I feel like those effects still hold up today, and I wish that more horror would go back to that practicality with their effects.
Yeah, that it looked real. I mean, everything these days, it's CGI, or it's a different, it's not the same as it was, like you're mentioning The Thing. That does still hold up very well today. It's a great film.
Yeah, I love, like I said, just everything about it. This, again, the story, and that's kind of where if things start taking off and I get a bigger budget for movies, I kind of want to try to hold that practical. I mean, I understand like there might be some scenes that might be a little bit of CGI, but I feel the limited it is, the more real that it feels and looks over time.
I want to get to your feature film that you're making here in a bit, but I wanted to go back to your podcast and your YouTube channel, because while you just made your first short film, you have a lot of stories on your YouTube channel. As you mentioned, Valentine Sucks. But what will people find if they tune into your podcast or your YouTube channel? But you actually voice the stories, right? Is that you?
Yes, that's me. Because when I was doing podcasting, what initially got me into it was like I was listening to a lot of horror narrators, and I wanted to stand out. So I was like, well, voice acting. And I was kind of hesitant at first because, being creative is very vulnerable. And so I was very scared of like, people saying like, oh, this is, cheesy, or this, it doesn't really come off as scary. So my first story, The Legend of Witch Lake, I was kind of like monotone and kind of just was narrating a story. And then after that, I was like, you know what, I'm just going to dive into it. So I did voice acting. I get a lot of voice actors. I add in the music, the sound effects, because I wanted to feel like a horror movie for your ears. And I feel like a lot of horror podcasts, like, yeah, there's horror narrations of people that talk about like movies and stuff, but there isn't like kind of like a movie experience, through podcasting. So that's where I was going with it. And a lot of these stories are just things that I'm thinking about. A lot of people, like for instance, my mom and my sister would be like, hey, so like Trash Can Dan, that story, we were watching a movie and my mom was like, I asked them, like, hey, after this movie, I want you to give me a theme, and after we watch this movie, I'll have a story for y'all. And so I forget what movie we were watching, but they were like, trash. And I was like, okay. And so while we were watching the movie, I was thinking about it. And then while it was over, I was like, oh, well, here's what I had. And Trash Can Dan became like an urban legend that I came up with.
I was woken up by a terrible odor. My whole room was filled with the foul stench of garbage. It smelled like a landfill. The overpowering smell made me start to gag. Whenever my eyes got adjusted to the darkness, my body froze in fear and my heart began to race. In the middle of my room stood a boy, or at least the stature of a boy. The figure was small, its body was mangled, disfigured, and covered in a brown wax that was dripping all over the floor. The figure also had no eyes, and it had a...
And that's what I like to go back to like things that everyday things that you don't really think about. So if you can make a story and make it about like toothpaste or everyone brushes their teeth, you know, so every time you brush your teeth, people think about that silly story that you came up with. So that's what I try to do is try to incorporate everyday things that people do, so they can so that horror kind of continues on.
If people want to listen to your podcast, where can they find it?
Max Paranormal. That's Macks Paranormal. On YouTube, on Spotify, every uh, kind of Apple Music, any kind of streaming services, I'll be there. And I actually have a TikTok too, where I do little snippets of like just horror factoids. So if you want to go to Max Paranormal, I'm there on TikTok as well.
So let's get back to, your first feature film that you're going to be making. Tell me about it and the idea behind it and what you're hoping to accomplish with this film.
So it's going to be an anthology. I love anthologies. Creep Show, another movie, is one of my favorites growing up. Uh, and so I love that kind of style of storytelling because with a short story, it's always like the best version of it. So there's no like fluff, there's no like character building. So it's like you get the meat and cheese of a story. And so it's going to be pretty much a tennis coach telling these stories, and yeah, that's pretty much all it is. It's a simple premise, but again, it's everything the way it's going to flow. We're really excited and to really tackle this full feature.
When are you planning to start filming, or what's your process for all of that?
So there's about four parts of this, four different stories. We're going to start filming in February, March timeframe. We're hoping to have it done before the summer so we can kind of submit it to as many film festivals as possible. We're really excited. Like we're just the script is solid. All the cast is two of the actresses that we use for Halloween Hour are going to be in there. And so just what I love about this film is that's going to showcase that Austin talent that yes, we're here and we want to, people are starving for it. So um, I guess the process is one, getting the script done. We're going to do a big pre-production meetings, make sure everything, is in order because filming, you want to make sure that it's a tight schedule. You don't want to like waste time, and so it's just a lot of planning and then like execution and making sure everyone knows their role. So it's a lot of work, but it's very rewarding. And I mean, I love being on set, and I love uh, kind of just like telling my stories visually.
So you've obviously written it. What other roles are you playing or taking on in the film? Are you directing? Are you acting in it? Anything else?
I wrote it, directing it, and also playing one of the characters, and it not that I really want to like show like be a character in my own films, but it's just for this case, it just makes sense with the character that I'm trying to portray. Um, but yeah, what I hope to do is after this film and say things kind of take off, I want to just make horror anthologies every year. I want to be like synonymous with like Halloween, so people are like, oh, I can't wait for the next Max Paranormal film to come out or wherever he may be. Because if a studio doesn't pick it up, we're definitely just going to keep making them as much as we can just to like kind of get a following, because I feel with the horror community, they want great films. Like I think a lot of us are tired of seeing like another Hellraiser film, another Halloween film. Like the first ones were great, but it's just kind of like diluted now. And I feel like studios kind of exploit horror fans because they just like, oh, we just slap, Halloween at the title, people are gonna come. And from a business standpoint, it makes sense. Like if you put in 10 million and then the movie makes like 70 million, like you made profit. But I feel like you could do so much more as opposed to just making movies that we've already seen.
What would be your ultimate goal in terms of the future with filmmaking? I know right now you're doing it indie. Would your hope be that a major studio would pick up something that you put out, or would be interested in moving forward with one of your ideas? What would you ultimately like to see?
Just be able to tell my stories, and if a studio does pick it up, I wouldn't compromise like how I would tell that story. So hopefully, and if things don't, a studio doesn't pick it up, we're still gonna make these stories. And the reason why I want like bigger budgets is because the stories that I want to tell kind of require that, you know. And so what we're doing is we're making the best of what we have, but it could just be so much more than that. And so hopefully the ultimate goal is to make horror movies every year, you know, for Halloween and have like a Halloween release. Just kind of because it's exciting, you know, and I love everything about horror. I could talk about it all day.
Me
And
too.
where I want to be, just kind of tell these stories and like make a community as well. So I feel like a lot of horror directors get a lot of ego behind them. But what I would do is I would, you know, talk to the fans, like, okay, well, what else would y'all like to see? And actually like get people more involved. And so I would just build a community and just, you know, tell the stories I want to tell is the ultimate goal. Kind of do it full time.
And I think what's great about the time that we're in now is that you do have a lot of power as an indie filmmaker, indie musician, because you're not dependent on a big studio or a big label to put out your art. You can find channels now to do that, whether it's through social media or other avenues, and even Indiegogo campaigns. I feel like that, while yes, it's still a challenge to fund and do things on your own, there's so much more freedom, it seems, these days with social media and the different channels that are available. Do you feel that way just in what you do with the podcast and you know, the short film and now moving on to the feature film?
Yeah, it's definitely a lot of freedom. I mean, there's pros and cons. The pros is that you have like again the freedom to do what you want, but the cons is like you probably don't have like the biggest of budgets. And so there's some films that you're like, oh man, that was awesome, but I just wish I had a little bit more of a budget to kind of tell that story correctly. So yeah, I mean it's great, and so it really comes down to is like if you get more of a following and you can make an income where you can tell these stories full time, then yeah, even if like a studio doesn't even have to pick it up, like I'll just post my videos on YouTube if I have to kind of generate that revenue and community. Because that's again, I love filmmaking. As soon as we finished Halloween Hour, I was like, let's make another one. Like I was like, I was already on it. Like it doesn't feel like work, even though it took like 14 hours to make that film. It at the whole time I just was having a good time, you know, with friends, and I was like, this is what I want to do. So even if I can do it full time, it doesn't make a lot of money, I don't care. I still just love, you know, filmmaking and the process that goes behind it.
And you mentioned friends. I mean, it's a tight knit community in the film world here in Austin as well. What have you found to be, you know, the experience being a filmmaker and, you know, tapping into the talent, whether it's actors, you know, people behind the scenes? What has that experience been like for you, finding those people that can be in the film and work on the film and production and etc.?
Oh, it's awesome. Like I everything about it. Again, once you find like a good crew, you just kind of stick with them and just kind of tell that story. Yeah, I met a lot of great people. Again, I just want people to see that like Austin, yeah, there's a lot of thirst and hunger for this. And if people are trying to make films, again, they're a lot of fun. And just do it, you know, just go for it. I was very hesitant because I was very like, oh, I'm not ready. Or when I do a movie, I wanted to have this like big budget. It's like, no, like make mistakes. Like it's even better if you make mistakes because you can learn from it. Even with Halloween Hour, I'm very proud of what it is. But I was like, oh man, we could have done this differently, or oh, we should have done this, or oh, there's a little error here. So it's just like it's cool to like see you grow. So I wish people would take that step. And again, it's very vulnerable, but it's definitely worth it in the end.
I have to mention that you were talking about your feature film and how a tennis coach is sort of narrating and telling the stories, which brings me around back to you, that you actually are very involved in tennis and have a business in coaching, right? Can you talk a little about that? I found that to be really interesting.
Yeah, so this is like the only time that I'll kind of interject myself in a film. This is because I was looking at actors, but I was like, this is pretty much just like me, you know, and what I do every single day. And I was like, yeah, I want to tackle it just this one time. And yeah, it's pretty much just a coach. Like what I do, I'm like, I'm on the court all day, and I love my job, and I love seeing players grow and like building a community. And like a lot of the times while I'm on the court, I think of like horror stories. I'm like, oh, this is cool. And like I'll be thinking about that as I'm, you know, telling kids to, you know, move their feet or stay low on their forehand. And so it's kind of just like me, the character's pretty much me, just kind of in this film. And so I'm really excited about it. It's going to showcase that like I that many people, everyday people, kind of like have these stories as well, and so it's just going to be very. Uh, I'm really happy with the script and dialogue. It's going to feel very real, and so yeah, so it's pretty much just me and a character.
That's pretty awesome though. But your coaching, what is it called? Your tennis
Oh, so
coach.
the academy is Mack Phillips Tennis Academy. We've been in business since 2019, and we are in Brown Rock. And yeah, if you want to sign up for lessons, then go on our website at phillipstennis.com, and we'll reach out to you.
And you never know, you may be able to, maybe one of those people will be in your film one day, you know, if they're great at
Yeah,
acting or something.
and it's, so yes, it's a lot of fun, and it's kind of cool because tennis is also a very tight knit community. So it'll be kind of, and I feel like it's an original idea. When you think of like horror, your mind doesn't instantly go to like tennis, you
Tennis.
know.
Yeah. So you mentioned that your mom and your sister are both into makeup and hairdressing. Are you using them, or are you planning to in the future at some point, maybe on any of your films coming up?
Oh yeah, they're gonna be there the whole entire time. They're and they kind of, their roles kind of extend more past just hair and makeup. My sister was actually in Halloween Hour. She was the ghoul. So,
Oh, awesome.
and my mom and my mom and my sister, they did the hair and makeup as well. So anytime I'm on a set, they're gonna be there. And it's gonna again extend past hair and makeup. They're gonna probably be like script supervisors as well, because they're like my gut check. Anytime I do a scene, I'll go back to them because they're cinephiles. Like my sister's just, uh, she knows so much about film. She's seen like hundreds, and she can kind of like, she's a good resource to have because they keep it real. So if I'm like, hey, how's this scene? They'll be like, oh, that sucked. We should probably redo that. Or, oh, I see what you're trying to do, but it doesn't resonate correctly. And so they're going to be there definitely as like my gut check. So yeah, they'll definitely be part of the process. Again, another thing with like the experience of filmmaking, it's not just the director. Like every time I come out with something, it's like kind of hard to take credit because there's just so many people that are a part of the process. You know, it's not just me. Like there's sound, there's lighting, there's camera work. There's just so much, and so that back to that question you told me earlier about like the experience. Like, yeah, just know that it's not just a one man show. There's definitely a lot of behind the scenes and a lot of people to make your stories come to life, which is something that I'm very fortunate to have like good people on my side to like tell these stories.